Good morning, everyone. This is Ask a Property Manager, episode number 18. Today is April 29th, 2020. Coming to you from Studio 1.0 here at Own Buffalo. I'm Andrew Schultz, Principal Broker of Own Buffalo, Inc. And on today's show, we're going to be discussing the criteria that we look at when we're screening prospective tenants. Before we jump into that, let's plug social media. New episodes of Ask a Property Manager hit every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern, live on Facebook. If you're watching this live, chances are you're already following us on Facebook, but if you found this from our YouTube page, make sure that you are subscribed to our Facebook page as well, facebook.com/Buffalo Foreclosed Homes. You can also follow us on Instagram at instagram.com/ownbuffalo. That's new within the last couple of weeks. And then obviously you can find a link to our YouTube page over at ownbuffalo.com. You can also click on if you're at YouTube, you can just search for Own Buffalo and we'll pop right up. You can also find some good chicken wing recipes that way, believe it or not. But go figure. Guys, while we're on the topic, May 1st is right around the corner. As a matter of fact, May 1st is just 2 days away. If you're worried that your tenants have not, or if you're worried because your tenants have not paid April rent and you're concerned that they may not pay rent in the month of May as well, grab a free 30-minute consultation over at ownbuffalo.com. I've got a couple of spots open for this Friday, May 1st, and then going into next week, I also have a few time slots open as well. Take advantage of that. It's a free opportunity to pick my brain. I can kind of walk you through what we're doing here, kind of help you develop a little bit of a system for yourself to get you through these trying times. Definitely jump on it. Head on over to ownbuffalo.com to grab that. So we're going to be jumping into our information on tenant underwriting in just a moment, but I did want to mention while I'm getting everything set up that the PPP and the EIDL loans have been funded again. So that was something that we talked about last week. That was voted on and was signed into law. Those funds have been put in place. There we go. Those funds have been put in place at this point, and I am hearing that people are starting to get funded. So if you're in a position where you've not yet been funded, definitely reach out to your bank, ask the question, find out what's going on if it's for the PPP loan. I am hearing people getting PPP loans pushed through. I've not heard much of anything on EIDL grants yet. I'm sorry, EIDL loans yet. So just, I don't think that the SBA is even taking phone calls on the EIDL stuff. They're basically just saying, we'll get to you when we get to you. You may have a little bit more luck talking to your banker at your local bank about the payroll protection, the PPP, but definitely don't wait. I mean, we talked about it last week, getting your paperwork and everything together. Hopefully you had an opportunity to do that. Sounds like the floodgates opened on Monday. And I think some banks may have already stopped accepting new applications because they're still processing old applications. So if you haven't had a chance to jump on those opportunities yet, definitely jump on them now. I don't know how much longer that stuff is going to be around and available for you to take advantage of. So definitely keep that in mind. We're going to jump right into tenant screening criteria here. We got quite a bit of information to cover today. This is part one of what's going to be a multi-part series. I don't know how many parts and I don't know how frequently we'll be publishing those parts. But as I was preparing for this episode last night, I realized there's just too much information to cover on tenant screening in one little segment. So this is going to be a multi-part series, and eventually what we'll do is take these little mini pieces and string them into one video and make it available on our YouTube page for you. That being said, if there's something that you're not seeing or you need an answer to before we get to that, feel free to reach out and I'll certainly do my best to answer your question whenever possible anyway. So again, this is part one of what's going to be a multi-part series. Today's basically just an overview of screening criteria. We're going to be doing more in-depth looks at each individual criteria and how we screen for them in the future. We're also going to be looking out for red flags and tricky things that tenants will try to do to get into an apartment, or should I say applicants will try to do to get into an apartment that you can catch on the front end. Just the little things that they try, the little tricks to get through the front door. So I will make a mention of the fact that we call it tenant underwriting as opposed to tenant screening in our office. And this was a change that we made maybe about a year or so ago. It was after I'd been to a conference and I was talking to another property manager, and they were talking about their tenant underwriting procedure. And I asked them the question, I'm like, why do you call it underwriting as opposed to screening? And he said point blank, it's the same as underwriting. And he's not wrong. If you look at an underwriting procedure for instance, a mortgage, a residential mortgage, compared to a tenant screening procedure, they're very, very similar. I mean, the criteria may vary a little bit. You may not be screening all of the same criteria. You may be screening different criteria. For instance, I don't know of any mortgage company that's doing a criminal background check, but we do as part of our tenant screening criteria. So, just something to think about. It really is an underwriting that you're doing, especially if you're a property manager and you're acting on behalf of a property owner that may not be in the area or something like that. You're really kind of looking at this tenant and underwriting everything that they're giving you to basically say, yeah, this is a good tenant. This is a tenant that we feel is going to perform to the best of their ability throughout the lease obligation. So we do call it tenant underwriting in our office as opposed to tenant screening. And the other thing I wanted to mention before we jump into any of the criteria is that tenant underwriting is a snapshot in time. The information that you're looking at today may not be valid tomorrow. And the reason I say that, and we'll get into it a little bit more here in just a few minutes, is things change very, very rapidly. And the information that you're looking at is literally from a snapshot in time. It's, if you're looking at a pay stub that's 2 weeks old, that's 2 weeks old, 2 weeks old. It's 2 weeks ago. That person may not have that job anymore. So it's definitely something to keep in mind when you're discussing this, that you're looking at a snapshot in time. So if you go back to look at something 6 months down the road and say, well, I don't understand why this tenant's not paying their rent. They have such a great job, blah, blah, blah. Things may have changed in that 6 month period between the time that you screen them and the time that they default on a rent obligation or something along those lines. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's a snapshot in time. It's one of those things that once you have your information and compile it, you basically archive it when you've placed your tenant, and you're good to go. So let's talk about our first criteria, which would be employment verification. Pretty straightforward. You want to make sure that whoever you're bringing into your home has employment in some form, or I shouldn't say income verification. We'll actually open that one up as well. We'll say income verification. Oops, yep, income verification and employment. These kind of go hand in hand. For someone who's employed, we're looking at at least a 1 year history. If they're self-employed, we're looking at least a 2 year history. So for the employed individual, just a standard employed individual, what we're looking for is to make sure that they are at a job currently, that they haven't been bouncing from job to job to job, that they have like a strong history of being not even necessarily at that same workplace for an extended period of time. Like people change jobs, regularly. I know in mortgages, what they'll look at is, well, did you stay in the same industry or did you move from one industry to another? That can be kind of a hiccup. That's not necessarily something that we look at on our end. We're basically just looking to make sure that the person has good, consistent employment that we can verify. As far as the income verification, again, these do kind of go hand in hand. We're looking for, on the employed individual, a 3 times the rent net income. So that's net income after all of your taxes and deductions. So we're looking at true net income after they've paid their taxes, their health insurance, their retirement, this, that, the other. We're looking at the true money that's actually coming into their bank account. That's what we're truly interested in, because effectively, that's the money that they have available to pay rent. All of those taxes and other bills and retirement and everything that comes off the top, it's all well and good. But they can't use that money to necessarily pay rent, at least without making changes to their paycheck situation, changing their withholding or something along those lines. So we're basically looking at just the net income after taxes, after expenses, and we want that to be 3 times the rent. That is market specific. And actually, I guess I should say all of our criteria are market specific. And the reason I say that, and we'll get into it more in a couple criteria down, the reason I say that is the criteria that works for us here in Buffalo may not work in San Diego, San Francisco, New York City, St. Louis, Missouri. The criteria that we have, there's kind of I don't want to call it a national standard or anything like that, but there's basically a lot of people kind of operate under the same criteria, more or less. Some people go up here, down here, whatever. But what works here in our market may not work in another market. And what I recommend for that is talk to local landlords, join a local landlord meeting group, something along those lines. If there's some kind of a forum where you can meet with other landlords, other property investors, people who are in the industry, a lot of times you can say, well, what are you using for criteria, and kind of get a feel for what works in your particular market. That being said, we're going to go back to income. We're looking at 3 times the rent in net income, and we are looking at that income from any of a variety of sources. Could be standard employment, could be self-employment income, Social Security, disability income, public assistance, Section 8 vouchers, any lawful source of income. The way the law is written in the state of New York, and I think that you're going to see this law coming into effect in a lot of other states, and I think it's actually in effect in quite a few, but basically any lawful source of income has to be considered when we are screening a tenant in the state of New York. By lawful income, what they mean is income not gained from illegal means, income that's being lawfully reported to the government so that it can be taxed. So we're not cashing, we're not looking at cash income from somebody who's working off the books. I can't use that. I can't verify it or anything along those lines, so I can't use cash income. Even waitresses with tips, if waitresses aren't claiming tips, waiters, waitresses, wait staff are not claiming tips on their pay stubs, I can't verify that information. So that's one of those situations where you'll find a lot of wait staff will tend to not claim some or all of their tips, which comes back to bite them when it's time to buy a house, rent an apartment, buy a car, lease a car, whatever the case may be. I definitely recommend, if you're a server or in the service industry and you have a tip income or a cash income, try to get that so that it's on the books whenever possible. That's going to make it so much easier for you when it comes time to qualify for literally anything in your life, to be able to show that that income is legit and it's run through a payroll, something along those lines, and taxes, the appropriate taxes are being paid on it. It sucks. I know it sucks to pay taxes on tips, but when you want to move forward in life, you're going to be much better off by claiming those tips. So for someone who is self-employed, typically what we're looking for in terms of employment verification and income, the income doesn't really change so much. We're still looking for that 3 times the rent net income, but the employment verification changes a little bit. So for someone who is self-employed, we're trying to find 2 full years of self-employment verification, and we usually do that via tax returns over the course of 2 years. Bank statements. We might even request like year-to-date data if we're, say, mid-year and we're looking at 18 and 19 data. We might actually request year-to-date data so that we can look at that as well to verify self-employment. Generally speaking, for self-employed people, it's a little bit more difficult to verify your income unless you're taking a regular monthly draw or you're on the payroll through your company or something like that and receiving a regular paycheck. If you're just taking sporadic draws here and there, it becomes very, very difficult to kind of verify that as income or consistent income. A lot of times what we'll do is, if someone is either self-employed or maybe even they're retired and they're not working, what we'll look for is a savings account with at least 6 months worth of rent in that account that's been seasoned for 6 months. And what I mean by seasoned is that money has been in place for 6 months. If we're going to use the mortgage parallel again, this would be the same as if somebody gifts you a bunch of funds and you stick them in your checking account and then try to get a mortgage the next day. Those funds aren't seasoned. You haven't had that gift of funds for that period of time to make it your money per se. So you're going to have to get that gift of funds letter from whoever gifted the funds to you. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. Our next criteria is credit score and payment history. And these kind of tie hand in hand as well. Our scoring criteria is set to a minimum credit score of 600. And again, this is based on our criteria here in our metro. I know some landlords who will not rent to anybody with under a 700 credit score. Good for them. If I did that in Buffalo, I would never rent an apartment. I also know some landlords, for instance, I know a gentleman in Ohio, I don't think he even has a base credit score. And if he does have a base credit score, it's incredibly low, like 500 or something like that. And all the more power to him as well, because there's no way that I could do that in Buffalo. That would just be considered too high risk for me. So what I think you'll find is your credit score is going to wind up, your credit score criteria is going to wind up correlating more or less to your class of properties. So for instance, we represent predominantly Class B and C properties here in Buffalo with a little bit of Class A mixed in for good measure. And this is on residential stuff. If you're finding that you're representing more A class and maybe B plus class stuff, you could probably move your credit score criteria up a little bit. If you find that you're, B minus, C, D class properties, you're probably going to have to lower your credit score criteria a little bit. So it's about knowing your market and understanding what a good criteria is based on your market. In our market, we find that 600 is a pretty good credit score for us to work with. It's achievable, and considering most of our rents are in the, let's say, $800 to $1,000 range, it's achievable for most people, it seems, and it does work. So keeping that minimum credit score criteria in place is a good idea. That being said, there are times when a credit score doesn't tell you the whole story, and you really need to look at the entirety of the credit report. When we look at the entirety of the credit report, there's some stuff that we just ignore altogether. For instance, medical debt and medical collections. It's so exceedingly easy to go into medical debt in this country, and actually medical debt is the #1 cause of people filing bankruptcy in this country. We don't look at medical debt as having an impact on your credit and background. The reason we do that, and yeah, I'm not saying you don't owe the money or whatever, but you can work with hospitals to set up payment plans that will help you out, that'll keep you moving forward. It's easy to work with most medical providers when it comes to getting a debt plan in place to work on that. But at the end of the day, we don't think that anybody should be denied an apartment because they got sick with cancer and fought and survived and managed to pull through. I'm not going to hold your medical debt against you. We used to actually say student loan debt as well, because we would find student loan debt would be, it's deferred. And then we would find a lot of people would start to ignore student loan debt. And we used to say, all right, well, we're not going to pay so much attention to student loan debt. We kind of reversed that decision when we revised our screening criteria the last time. And the reason we did that is because student loan debt is actually lienable. They can actually take a piece of your paycheck. If you have unpaid student loan debt, if you've defaulted on your student loan debt, they will find you and they'll start taking cash right off the top of your paycheck, which then reduces the amount that you have available to pay rent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now we do look at student loan debt to make sure student loans are being paid and on time and things like that. Things that are red flags for us would be utility collections and collections to other landlords. If you have a utility collection, a lot of times they won't let you establish a new utility account in your name, at least until such time that a payment plan is put in place or that account is cleared off. So that's definitely an issue. If you have an apartment where a tenant has to take the electric and gas in their name and they can't qualify for an electric or a gas account because they have collections, that's obviously an issue. And obviously, we don't like to see any of our tenants coming in owing other landlords money. It means that there was some kind of a situation in the past that resulted in a balance being due, that there wasn't some kind of a compromise that could be made or a payment plan put in place or something like that. If it's on your credit report, it's already gone through the collections and everything else. So that's definitely a red flag as well. So that's something that we keep in mind. We look at bankruptcy. Our credit reports will pull bankruptcy records as well. If it's an open bankruptcy or it's a bankruptcy within the last 24 months, that's generally going to be a denial for us, especially an open bankruptcy, because it's very easy for you to get caught up in the bankruptcy proceeding, not be able to evict the tenant during that time if they stop paying, and it can turn into a real nasty situation really, really fast. So that's always something that we are mindful of. So beyond all that, when I'm looking at someone's credit history, what I'm looking for is to make sure that they're paying bills on time and that they're not defaulting on their obligations. So the way I like to describe it is income shows me your ability to pay rent, and your credit score and your credit history tells me your willingness to pay rent. So again, income will show me that you can pay it, you have the available resources, and your credit history and your credit score will show me your willingness to pay it in a lot of instances. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Next criteria, landlord reference and payment history. So this is basically your residence verification. What we're trying to determine is, do you have 2 years of verifiable rental history? Or not even rental history, 2 years of verifiable residence history. Because there's all types of people who, you might be a student who was living at home and then you were in dorms for 4 years or something like that. You're not going to have a rental history per se, but we are going to be able to verify your residence as being, wherever you were living when you were not living in the dorms. So it's, something like that. It's not necessarily 2 years of rental history, it's 2 years of verifiable residence history. We're looking for unbiased sources. So if you are, for instance, renting an apartment, but it's from a family member, we're probably not going to use that as a reference because they're going to be biased when they give their reference in most instances. What we would look for in that instance would be usually a copy of the lease, a utility bill showing your ID, showing the address that you say you're living at, pay stubs showing the address that you're living at, and then either canceled rent checks or something from your bank account, like a bank statement showing that you're making monthly rental payments on a regular basis. So that would be kind of the way that we would handle somebody who may not have a traditional landlord reference. So what we would do for someone with a traditional landlord reference is the first thing we look at is the tax record for the property. What we're doing is comparing the name on the tax record to the name that they're giving us to see if they match. A lot of times you'll get people that'll try to sneak in a fake landlord reference, and that's one of the easiest ways to catch it. There are other ways to screen around that, and we'll talk about that when we do another part of this video when we're talking about individual criteria. So that's something to keep in mind when you're screening for your residents and things like that. When you do talk to a landlord, there's questions you're going to want to ask beyond just, how much was their rent and did they pay their rent on time? There's more questions you can ask. We'll get into that in another part as well. Next criteria that we're going to discuss here today is going to be the criminal background check. As part of our credit check, we also get a nationwide criminal background check that is relayed back to us. Talk to an attorney to build a policy that works for you in terms of criminal history. The HUD guidance on this states very, very clearly that you cannot have a one-size-fits-all, no criminal background, any criminal check. If anything pops on the criminal check, you're not going to be approved. You're automatically denied. HUD has come out and said via their guidance that that's just not okay. That's completely against their guidance. Unfortunately, the rest of their guidance is about as clear as mud and indicates that you should be handling criminal histories on a case-by-case basis. My problem with that is I'm not a judge, I'm not an attorney, and I wasn't the jury. How am I supposed to evaluate anything like that on a case-by-case basis when I wasn't involved in any aspect of that? It doesn't make sense to me. So the HUD guidance on this is incredibly poor. That's why I recommend talking to an attorney to help you build out a policy that is compliant with the HUD guidance. Unfortunately, the HUD guidance is clear as mud, and multiple attorneys have said the same thing, that they would love to see clearer guidance come out, but getting clear guidance from HUD, we literally just got better guidance years after the fact on emotional support animals. I wouldn't anticipate clear guidance coming down the pipeline anytime soon. So speak to an attorney, have them help you develop a policy that's not one size fits all. Because if you do have that flat out, any criminal background pop is an immediate denial, that is in violation of what the HUD guidelines would be. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. And the last criteria, actually this isn't even a criteria, the last thing I wanted to mention today is cosigners. With cosigners, we basically use all of the same criteria that we would on a typical tenant, with the one difference being we require them to have 4.5 times net, 4.5 times the rent in net income. The reason we do that is because obviously if that person is required to step in and pick up the rent on this unit because the tenant defaults, they need to be able to cover not just the rent on this apartment, but all of their other expenses. So if they have their own rent or mortgage and car payments and this and that and the other thing, we want to make sure that they have enough free and clear income that if the time comes where they need to step in to basically pay this rent obligation, we want to make sure that they have the available funds to do so. So we use all of the other criteria, basically are screening out exactly the same, but we do bump that income criteria up to a 4.5 times the rent net income. So that pretty much covers what I wanted to talk about with regards to the screening criteria today. As I mentioned, that's going to become a multi-part series as time goes on here. I don't really have a timeline for how often we're going to be releasing these, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see these at least on a monthly basis, as you know, kind of continuing this part of the series until we get it complete. And then, like I had said, when everything is said and done, what we'll do is eventually take the entire series and combine it into one longer video that you'll be able to find on our YouTube page. Guys, that pretty much wraps things up for Ask a Property Manager this week. Thank you so much for joining us. I really do appreciate it. New episodes of Ask a Property Manager drop every Wednesday, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can find those live on Facebook at facebook.com/Buffalo Foreclosed Homes. While you're at it, you can follow us on Instagram, instagram.com/ownbuffalo. You can also subscribe on YouTube by going to YouTube and searching for Own Buffalo or grabbing the link off of ownbuffalo.com. And last but not least, grab your free 30-minute phone consultation with me over at ownbuffalo.com. Thank you so much for watching. I love producing Ask a Property Manager, and it's great that you guys can help us improve. Drop a question in the comments either on Facebook or YouTube, and your question may be answered in an upcoming episode. As a matter of fact, next week's episode, May 6th at 10 a.m., is a Q&A episode. So if you drop your question in the comments either on Facebook or YouTube sometime this week, chances are pretty good that we're going to be picking up your question and answering it next week live on the show. If you enjoyed this content or if I brought some value to your day, please hit that thumbs up button. YouTube and Facebook both push videos based on community feedback, and we want to help as many people as possible find us. The best way for you guys to help is to throw a like at us. It really does help to get us pushed up the ranks a little bit. We want to try to get our information out to as many people as possible. As I'd mentioned, next week's episode will be May 6th, 10 a.m. That's going to be a question and answers episode. So that'll be all community-driven questions. And if you have a question you want answered, feel free to either leave it in the comments on either Facebook or YouTube. You can also schedule your free 30-minute phone call, and we might even pull your question from there and answer it a second time on the show live. Guys, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.